Well, hello everyone, and welcome this afternoon to a open conversation live stream. My name is Stephen Roach Knight with Transform Network, and I'm excited to be here with three brilliant people that I'm excited to have this conversation with today about evangelicals and race. And we're going to be looking at some groundbreaking new research. And we're going to be getting it explained to us by the lead researcher, one of the lead researchers, Dr. Janelle Wong from the University of Maryland. Here to help me understand it and help you understand it is Dr. Gerardo Marti from Davidson College and Pastor Anthony Smith from Mission House in Salisbury, North Carolina. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
All right. Wednesday off.
Yes, it's Veterans Day observed, so we've got at least Anthony, a little bit more of Anthony's time today, which worked out great. Dr. Wong, Janelle, just to set this up real quickly, back in August, Dr. Gerardo Marti was at a conference where you were presenting this research, and he had shared on social media. Jaws just dropped when they saw this data getting shared, and so that really piqued my interest. And obviously, the topic of the evangelical church and race and racism and white supremacy and kind of how all these things come together. I really appreciate it. I reached out to you and you agreed to sit down and have this conversation. So really thank you for being available and to share with us more about this research and what it is and what you found. Can you give us a summary, overview of what this new research is telling us?
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for having me here. And it's an honor to be here with Dr. Marti and also with Pastor Smith. And I'm excited to have this conversation. This research is a long time in the making. I started this project 10 years ago. Wow. And it involved a real interest in growing numbers of Latino and Asian American evangelicals that I saw growing and growing. I had been doing research on Asian American and Latino political participation and the role of community organizations in fostering that participation. And as I did some ethnographic research, it became clear that ethnic churches were the largest ethnic organizations in both of these communities. And I saw that, it looked like white evangelicals were sort of at a steady kind of not increasing at all. And the growth area for evangelicals was going to be people of color and particularly new immigrant communities. And I started collecting survey data. I started to, I interviewed 80 people. I did field work in Houston and LA, and I kept doing that and doing it. And election after election went by. And prior to the 2016 election, my friend and colleague, Robbie Jones, wrote a book called The End of White Christian America. And I was thinking, wow, we are doing such similar work, because I was also working on a project where I was looking at how would growing numbers of Asian Americans and Latinos change the traditional Christian right. And then the election happened. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'll see if I can share this slide here, that basically what we saw is not so fast. Evangelicals made up one out of every 4 voters, and white evangelicals voted for, that won't work to change it, but white evangelicals voted for Trump at 81%. And I was still writing the book about how people of color are going to transform the traditional Christian right. And I stepped way back and said, oh, that's not what this book is about. This book is really about how white evangelicals may be maintaining power in the face of massive demographic change. I couldn't believe it, right? And so I started to look at that. We know that, you know, these groups make up now, Asian Americans and Latinos make up about 13% of all evangelicals. And we know that Black evangelicals are the group that's most likely to identify as born again. And yet we still see this tremendous voting bloc in the electorate, white evangelicals, who, despite the criticisms of some Christian leaders of Donald Trump's moral values, etc., still threw their support behind Donald Trump. And I wondered, what is going on there? And so I started looking more deeply into white evangelical attitudes, comparing them to Black, Asian American, and Latino people who identified as born again in terms of their beliefs. So at the main research finding is that white evangelicals across the board tend to be, and this is no surprise to those in this video call, they tend to be much more conservative on many more issues than Black, Latino, or Asian American evangelicals. So it's not just, you know, on issues of, let's say, support for Trump. We see there's a big gap. So actually, you know, Black, Asian American, and Latino evangelicals look a lot more like other Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans than they do like white evangelicals. And so we start to see this split, and that's pretty much the case for a range of issues. The one that stands out a lot to me is redistributive issues. So whether or not you support big government, whether or not you think there should be taxes on the rich, you see this real break between people of color who identify as born again and white evangelicals. And that's true even among groups that have a high average income, like Asian Americans. So I was looking at this and thinking, wow, religion is not necessarily driving these political attitudes. We see race really fundamentally in operation here, where people of color look totally different from white evangelicals. And so what does that mean if white evangelicals are still pushing the same agenda? And I don't mean everyone. Obviously, much of this audience is not adopting conservative views across the board. But I wanted to understand better what was driving the majority of white evangelicals. 81% is not a small number supporting Trump, right? And so I delved more deeply, and I'll wrap up here with this finding, that the key measure for me was looking at feelings of what I call like in-group embattlement. What does that mean? I try to operationalize it by looking at, to what extent do you think, this is a question asked in the survey, to what extent do you think your group faces discrimination? And then they were also asked about the degree of discrimination faced by other groups. And I combine these questions to create this new measure of what I call in-group embattlement. And that is, to what extent do you think your group faces the same or more discrimination as Muslim Americans? Now, Muslim Americans are in every group, but they're a minority of every group. And so what did I find? I found that 30% of all whites believe that their group faces the same or more discrimination as Muslims. Among evangelicals, 50%. And what does this mean? That measure, that feeling of in-group embattlement predicts conservative attitudes ranging from opposition to Black Lives Matter, to climate change, to the redistribution of wealth, to support for the healthcare across the board, and also predicts opposition to abortion rights, opposition to same-sex marriage. And predicts support for Donald Trump, support for the Republican Party. And this is even controlling for these other issues. It's not just a matter of partisanship, because when I control for partisanship, that feeling of embattlement still drives those conservative attitudes. When I control for South. It's not just region. It still drives those feelings. When I control for just general conservatism, it's still out there as one of the main predictors. Now, for other groups, like African Americans, who say, yeah, we feel our group faces as much discrimination as Muslim Americans, it doesn't predict any conservative attitudes, right? For Latinos, if they feel their group faces the same amount or more discrimination as Muslim Americans, it doesn't predict any conservative attitudes. So if there's something going on with race and feelings of in-group embattlement among evangelicals, for Asian Americans, if they feel their group faces as much or more discrimination as Muslims, and it's a small number of people who do, much smaller than among whites, but some who do, we do see it matters, not across the board, but on issues having to do with race and immigration, those folks are more conservative. So I'll just end there. That's the kind of findings in a nutshell.
Wow. Anthony, I'm really interested to get your kind of initial reaction to this research, but let me ask Gerardo first, and give you a little bit more time to think about this. Gerardo, you heard this research back in August. What is still kind of, it clearly impacted you. Kind of what is your take on it, and what's maybe a question that you have for Dr. Wong that you would like to ask to go a little bit deeper?
Well, I'm really loving the work of Janelle Wong, and the reason why is because, like a lot of people, I'm the kind of guy who reads a lot of the opinion pages. I watch the talking heads on television. I'm interested in the kind of analysis that is out there. And yet, whenever someone does rigorous, really sharp, good work that hits these questions so clearly and so directly, you have to admire it. We're now not in the realm of opinion. We're not trying to assert one thing or another or a set of values. Here we have actual data and we're trying to make sense of these patterns. And for many years, it's exactly as Janelle was saying. For many years, we thought that the rise of color, the diversity initiatives, the attempt on the part of the evangelical church to do racial reconciliation and to correct things from the past, the movement of denominations to try to get more churches that are churches of color and to adopt them and bring them into their denominational circles. We thought that all of that was going to be changing the nature of conservative Christianity into the future. And then, just as she said, 2016 happened. And 2016, as an election of white evangelicalism. And that has been something that has been shocking to many people. And it's been dismaying for a lot of people. And yet there are other people who seem to have no problem and see that, just keep moving here. Let's just keep moving here. And so I think that what I and other social scientists are so impressed by is we suspect something is going on. We suspect that there are long historical patterns that are reasserting themselves in really distinctive and important ways. But Janelle's work is among the first to show this in a clear, direct, and unambiguous way. So what I admire is the power of the work that she has been doing and her team, because she is giving us the actual stuff to work with so that we can then build actual knowledge rather than just speculation.
Right. And to that point, Janelle, your data, as I understand it, something like 10,000 respondents, over 100 researchers who worked on this with you. Is that correct?
So I'm getting a little feedback. Turn down my. Yes, that's correct. I think if we when we're not talking, we won't back. So everyone who's not talking, let's put our mutes on.
Yep, I got it.
Okay, so thank you. First of all, that is super exciting to me, and I feel really flattered by Dr. Marquis' words, because he cited throughout, this is a book project that I've been working a long time, cited throughout this book. So thank you so much. It's really meaningful to me. This project, yes, is based on survey data taken that was collected directly after the 2016 election with 10,000 individuals, and it has a large sample of not only whites but also Blacks, Latinos, and Asian Americans. It was a group of 80 people who put this survey together, and the survey was conducted in English and also in several Asian languages and in Spanish. And so there are some issues with the survey, but overall, I think those issues would not impact the relative differences between these groups. And that is really what this study is about. I just want to echo this point about white evangelicals and their power in this past election. So we all heard that quote about white women voting for Trump, 53% of white women. But if you look deeper into those data, if you remove white evangelical women from that equation, then a majority of white women did not vote for Donald Trump. They voted for Hillary. Very few people know that, but that's how powerful white evangelicals were in this election.
Wow. What are your thoughts just hearing this? And obviously the research goes beyond the election, right? We're talking about deep issues with the evangelical church as it pertains to race.
My turn?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So as an African-American pastor who, and when you say African-American evangelical, that gets tricky because even when you even identified me in a post, like Evangelical Pastor Anthony Smith, I was like, it's kind of tricky with us, especially me, because I would say that I'm in that stream, but I got Pentecostal roots as well, but also the prophetic aspect, the social justice aspect of my faith. And I actually sit within a denomination that in many ways identifies as evangelical. I'm in the Wesleyan Church. But we have a social justice element to us. And so there's some it's complicated, right? And so, but I realize the tension. I recognize the tension oftentimes, and even with some of the things I engage in as an activist pastor who affirms much of Black Lives Matter in my own community. But I hold to traditional Christian beliefs. But when I'm in conversation with my more white evangelical brothers and sisters, oftentimes there is tension. But for me, I read Dr. Jones's work, just becoming familiar with Dr. Wong's work, and what it highlights to me is how much of evangelical Christianity is unaware of how whiteness is attached to evangelicalism. Like, you can't separate them, right? Like, you can't be evangelical and not be captured by the spectacle and liturgical performance of whiteness in church. And so you can't, because they're of a piece. And so I think what 2016, the election, I call it an apocalyptic moment in many ways. It revealed how racial identity or the power of whiteness, not necessarily white people per se, right, but just the power and performance of whiteness itself is pretty much at the core of evangelicalism. And so literally all these attempts to try to redefine and rename and upgrade or retool evangelicalism until it addresses its performance of whiteness in this culture, it won't move very far. And so I think that is something that's hitting me. And as a pastor that's on the ground, as an activist, trying to keep in conversation with academia and research, I'm always asking, at the level of discipleship, are pastors interrogating whiteness from baptism, from Eucharist, to how we do discipleship in our churches? And so this research is very important. I think it should inform the ways in which we talk about embodying the gospel in our communities and how we engage in processes of discipleship. Are we naming the power of whiteness in this? And that's a startling thing that many people, well-intended, can't even see this. They can't even. It defies explanation. I'm like, how can you, on one hand, question the American citizenship status of President Barack Obama, who has no controversy. There's nothing, like there's no anything. Question his whether he's a citizen because he wasn't white, right? There's some issues with American white identity and citizenship. But then here's a gentleman who clearly has a past and obviously some kind of present. He's the most, I wouldn't put him before the Boy Scouts. And yet he's lifted up as God's man. But here's a black man who identified with some level of progressive Christianity. He couldn't be identified as an American, let alone a Christian. He was a Muslim, as to say. And so I think a lot of my white brothers and sisters, evangelicals trapped in that. They can't see beyond their whiteness. They can't see it. And that's what's frustrating to me as a pastor on the ground.
Janelle, I'm curious. What I heard you saying earlier was this idea of the deciding factor or the unifying sort of factor being, I think, what you called in-group defensiveness. Did I get that right?
It is. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm looking for a word, so I would love to hear some feedback. What is the appropriate terminology when you think your group that is relatively has some advantages in society? And this goes back to, I think, this idea. I choose embattlement, but I think I said in-group embattlement. But there might be something else. There is a feeling, I think, that's not new of in-group persecution among white evangelicals that is hundreds of years old and maybe thousands. And so the idea is, what exactly is that? I mean, theorizing this is really hard for me. I am a social scientist who works with a lot of data sets. I'm not a scholar, clearly, of religion, but I'm interested in what drives this feeling. Why is it so much higher among white evangelicals than whites in general, which is also, what I'm saying here doesn't just in some ways apply to white evangelicals. It is intensified. It's at a different level, but we do see it also among 30% of whites in general. So we're looking at something that is very, very far-reaching, and maybe is what's going on in America right now, but through this lens of the evangelical population. So I'd love to hear feedback on the term, on what you think is going on. It's about belonging, as Pastor Smith said. It's about notions of belonging, and there's like this element of nostalgia there. So let me open it up.
For me, my experience has been, there's been this nostalgia piece, right? I heard this recently with the recent controversy with Judge Rory Moore, Senate candidate in Alabama, my home state. And they were playing some recent clips of his over the past couple of years. And you hear this a lot. There's a sense of loss, like we're losing something. We're losing our identity. We're losing the culture. Literally, we're losing the world. And it reminded me of a quote that I read many years ago by W.B. Du Bois. He says, what is whiteness? And he says, it is to rule the world forever and ever and ever. And so I'm paraphrasing what he said. And so there's a sense of entitlement to reality that's tied in with this identity. And so it seems like with more diversity, the demographic shifts, even people of color claiming some of the language of evangelicalism, I think that there's a sense of loss, like we're losing our ownership. And I don't think it's like conscientious, like, hey, we're losing our ownership, but our reality is being, their reality, I think, is being perceived as fading away. And that's kind of me. So it's almost like a loss, a sense of loss or losing something.
Mm-hmm. Gerardo, did you want to jump in on this?
He's muted.
Yeah.
Okay, we're good?
There we go. Yeah, there you go.
I've been teaching a course this semester called Race, Religion, and Donald Trump, something that I started to create once the election happened, knowing that it would be important for us to try to analyze and figure this out. I think one of the missing pieces, not the only one in this conversation so far, is understanding the history of immigration in the United States. At the very beginning of the, before even the Republic was founded, there was talk about the United States of America becoming a new race, that Americans were a new race of people that were a unique amalgam of like Germans and French and British, and that that America was taking the most superior qualities of these other races and becoming something brand new. And from that point, there's always been some sense of who has been established as a real American, who's a true American, you know, who really belongs as an American. And in terms of the newer movements, when we started to see the Chinese coming in, then people started to freak out. And when we started to see Italians and the Greeks started to freak out. And so the immigration policies that began to restrict different groups from coming into the United States, all of that was based on this notion of who do we really want here? Because they're upsetting the good order, you know, whether it was economics or the claim that they were taking jobs or things like that, all of that became an issue. And so at different points in time, there was a desire for restricting those things. Now, around the turn of the 19th to 20th century, the foreign-born population of the United States came up to about 15% of the population. And what you see is that immigration policies accelerated at the same time that the percentage of foreign-born entered into the United States. Now that then was restricted so much that it went to nearly zero in the 50s. Then it started to go back up. And you know that right now we are just coming to that 15% figure once again. And so there is an argument to be made that once white America starts to see that there are people of color, and that people of color introduces a foreignness to such a degree that we no longer understand our America, or has been the phrase that's been used, strangers in their own land, that there have been now new counter movements to attempt to assert that nativism one more time. That sense of let's reestablish what the real America is. And that was clearly evident through the Obama presidency. And the book to recommend there is a book called Change They Can't Believe In, an award-winning book by two political scientists that dissect the rise of the Tea Party and the way in which they aggressively opposed Obama. And that looks at the issue of race very, very deep, in a very detailed way, and the issue of religion that I think is so enlightening for understanding where we are today.
I mean, it seems like it's really no coincidence that post 1965 you have increasing immigration and the consolidation of white evangelicals and the Republican Party.
Right. Well, one of the things I want to bring up is there have been a couple other studies that have come out in the last couple of months that are saying exactly the same thing that I think your research is saying. They're in very much in alignment. There was a study done that came out at the end of October by NPR. Looked at different racial groups' views on discrimination. The title was Discrimination in America, Experiences and Views of African Americans. Majority of people, 3,453 adults were polled, and almost all of the media reports on this study focused on the responses from white people, even though the actual study was really more focused on the African American community and their views of discrimination. But I think the reason the media besides, we could say white supremacy. The reason the media focused on it was so startling that so many white Americans responded to the survey to say, we feel discriminated against. And I think that's in alignment with this in-group embattlement or in-group persecution that you're talking about. And then the other survey that I wanted to bring up and just kind of get the three of you's reactions to was another one that came out from Public Religion Research, I believe, on the shifting views of morality among white evangelicals, and how during the Obama administration, when this question was asked, how accepting are you of politicians' indiscretions? How many voters have changed their mind about personal morality? And the shift went from, during the Obama administration, white evangelicals being the least tolerant of personal immorality in politicians, to now the same question being asked post-Trump, and now white evangelicals are the most tolerant of personal immorality among politicians. So there's really something interesting there in kind of all of these different surveys coming together. And I think the question for the three of you that I'm really interested in is, I think we're used to, at least for me, in the church and in social justice circles, talking about white supremacy and dismantling white supremacy. And how do we really do that unless we address this in-group embattlement, in-group persecution issue? Hold on, Anthony. Got to unmute you here.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
Going back to something Dr. Marty said regarding immigration, American identity, even preceding the creation of America, going back to the Enlightenment project and European Enlightenment, the conception of the individual was a centered white self. Right, so there's a connection between the creation of what we call the individual person out of modernity and the Enlightenment, and the connection with the racial identity of whiteness. Right, so an individual was a white male in particular. Everybody else were kind of whatever they were, and so that pouring into the creation of the American experiment, because a lot of the founding fathers of our country were students, active students of the Enlightenment, right? So fundamental to American identity is the idea of whiteness itself, this white-centered self, right? And so what's being challenged now is that very self. Is being decentered. And so from my own experience, being decentered can be enjoyable if you're very intentional about it. But when you're forced to be decentered by the environment that you're in, like Dr. Marty said, these kind of counter moves to this, and that's kind of where I'm at. That's what I'm seeing. The very fundamental identity of what it means to be an individual in this society, in particular as an American individual in this society, is being challenged. And so until we address that, it's hard to even have those deeper conversations around dismantling white supremacy. I can't tell you how many debates and arguments I've gotten in when I started naming white supremacy, and I've had white people, especially my more conservative evangelical friends, say, Anthony, you shouldn't use that word. You know, it's not a good way to start a conversation. I'm like, but y'all invented the word. Y'all invented the word. This is not language that does not emerge out of leftist, social justice, far left conversation circles. That was language I used during the Confederacy. This is language that was used during the White Citizens Council. Yeah. And so there is an unconsciousness of how centered many folks are in their whiteness. And it's not just white people. Anybody can be a white person or participate in whiteness. People of color can participate in whiteness in ways they may not even be aware of it. Part of my own journey as a person of color is learning how to exercise out of my own spiritual life the power and practice of whiteness in myself. And so for me, the fundamental thing is decentering that identity, or decentering that performance that prevents people from even seeing and questioning and interrogating white supremacy and dismantling racism. If that makes any sense what I just said. But
that was a lot.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, that was great. I think, and I appreciate the focus on kind of, here we are 1 year later, 1 year into the Trump presidency, and I have a hard time still putting those two words together. I'm still kind of just baffled and dumbfounded. So I appreciate the particular focus on politics and kind of how this has played itself out. But I think for myself personally, someone who has come up out of the evangelical church, the research, Janelle, has me asking just at a deep core level, like, how deep does white supremacy go in the evangelical church? And as a project, is it even salvageable in terms of, when we talk about, like Gerardo was saying, racial reconciliation and these kinds of diversity efforts? And like, it seems like here we are, all the efforts that have happened up till this point still have so far to go in the evangelical church. And how do we do that? And one of the things that I'm hearing you say is we really need to look at this in persecution and how to address that and how to help white evangelicals not feel that way.
So thanks for those comments. It's a really sobering set of findings, I have to say. And at the same time, I don't want to paint such a broad brush. What I do in the larger project is look at some of the structural challenges to attaining power among not only people, non-white evangelicals, but also white progressive evangelicals. So what are those kind of structural impediments to power? Why can't these groups that are fast growing, that have pretty good talking points, I would say, why can't they get their agenda more centered among evangelicals? And I do think it's because of this feeling of persecution that there has to be a defense around those things. So everything that white evangelicals say, white progressive evangelicals and many non-white evangelicals, it's immediately linked to the Democratic Party and immediately considered something that needs to be defended. And that's why you see, I think, the finding that you were talking about morality, because for this group, the expression of religion is coming through partisanship in many ways. And so moral judgments here, we're seeing, that is crazy, that finding, that, under Obama, morality, the standards for morality are one thing, and under Trump it's something else. And that is really, partisanship is a powerful drug, and it has become totally coupled with I think which is interesting, with religious identity. And that's very unique, I think, in the United States. Lydia Bean writes about white evangelicals in Canada, and it's a different dynamic, and it does make a difference. So I think the questions going forward are really about what are the kind of structural issues in place that prevent even power sharing, right? There's not even really even power sharing, and it has to do with segregated churches, right? You can't deny that. Segregated places, we've been sorting like crazy in this country, and so people aren't really, there's barely any places where you're going to see progressive evangelicals and conservative evangelicals really interacting much anymore. And so that's a structural issue, I think. And the question is, and I think probably Robert Jones is also asking this question. I mean, he's made the assertion, I'd love to hear what other people say. Is this a last gasp? Is this there's been this consolidation of white evangelical power, and does that mean there's just more power going forward in terms of this conservative agenda, or is this a moment of defense because, and I now hesitate to make the prediction, because the tide of demographic change may be coming.
All right. I have learned a great deal this past year, partly because I'm mystified, just like many other people, to try to understand, how does religion matter, and is it about religion? This is part of the issue that we're all kind of grappling with. And what I have discovered is, I go, okay, was it something that happened during Bush? Well, no. Was it Clinton? Was it Reagan? Then I keep going back further. Was it Nixon? Wait, was it Lyndon Johnson and the things going on there? Well, I was surprised that conservative fundamentalist Bible preachers so aggressively fought against communism and felt that communism was atheistic and definitely not the American way, that they fiercely opposed FDR's programs as essentially coming from Satan. So when you start seeing that J. Vernon McGee preached that FDR's program was a halfway house to communism, you start to realize that there is a depth of how white evangelicals have come to understand not just the way we relate to racial issues, but the way in which economics plays into that. And so we shouldn't help people who have been historically oppressed, because by doing so, we're actually invoking those things that would lead us to communism. That we should not be favoring certain groups, because that's not what God would do. And if God has distributed talents in different ways, well, then so be it. The talents are just working out that way. And so when you start playing it out in this really intriguing way, you see that white evangelicals simply do not see it as a racial issue. I mean, Anthony is absolutely right. They do not understand it as a racial issue. To call it a racial issue, everybody knows you're not supposed to be racist, and that provokes all the incredible defensiveness. So there is some strategy pedagogically. This is, of course, my concern as a teacher, as a professor, as a researcher, is how do I go about helping people to understand these things, these fundamental structures that go so largely unseen, that really are invincible to people. But for someone who's an activist, it's more like, okay, where are the strategic levers of power that need to be challenged? Who is it that needs to be actively deposed? What kinds of voices do we need to be given the kind of platform that would allow them the right kind of hearing? And so the polarization is here. We're not going to be leaving this polarization soon, but I agree that there's something about the essence of what it means to be white, and the economic and theological attitudes that revolve around that, so that it becomes about theology and it becomes about proper economic structures, not so much about race, even though race is fundamental to it all. So being able to unpack all of that, it takes a tremendous amount of work. It's really hard to do, but we shouldn't think that it just showed up in 2016. I think we all are smart enough to know that. It's that the work of the historians, the American religious historians, now the social scientists gathering better data, that's the kind of thing that's helping us to get better information so that we're not misinformed. So we know that America was not established as a Christian nation, and yet people persist in believing that. We know that it's not just about morality, or at least a really strange kind of morality, where you say, okay, we don't want people to have an abortion, but it's okay to have sex with a 14-year-old. This new thing with Ray Moore is just crazy. So the tweaking of morality helps me to see that they're not really concerned about personal morality. It's really about asserting a particular social order that they see as right. It's a particular way of seeing what kinds of policies should we have, because we want to see what kinds of lives people should be living. And then what we don't see is that sneaky and unseen power of corporations and a tremendous amount of wealth that goes towards asserting certain kinds of policies that would continue to keep a dominantly white, dominant conservative aspects of power, and in power for a long time, because they're fundamentally changing the rules as they go along in order to sustain the game in their favor. And so one of the more persuasive books that I've read recently, which is not uncontroversial, mostly because she names names, is Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains. Another book worth reading to really see where do things come from in trying to assert particular policies, and how the racial aspect is obscured because it sounds like we're doing the right thing in the name of democracy, in the name of liberty, in the name of power. But these things are being tweaked in really intriguing ways, and most people just don't know. So what bothers me most is that conservatives feel like their values are being affirmed, but I think that they're being manipulated. And I don't want to be manipulated. I don't think they should feel like they want to be manipulated either. If they could understand the ways in which their sincere beliefs are being tweaked for agendas that really have a much darker side to them, I think that things would change also.
Anthony, I want to go to you. I heard Gerardo just say part of what he just said was we can't separate these things, race and economics and politics. It's all tied together and it's all connected. And we're talking about the evangelical church in this conversation. I do want to point out that if you look at, I think it's Public Religion Research, the data on white Protestant mainline churches is not that far off from the evangelical church. So white Christianity has this issue that is, for what I'm hearing from Janelle, is actually amplified. The general public, the general white population, is here, and you add religion to the mix, and it just goes up another level. And so, I think your heart and my heart would be to say, how do we deal with this, right? How do we help faith communities look at when it's so complex and it's all interwoven? It's race and it's economics and it's politics and it's all of these things. Like I guess how can this research maybe just be fuel for fire to say, my gosh, we've got to do something about this. I don't know. What are your thoughts right now, Anthony?
Well, I think for me, for most of my own writing and preaching and engagement with other people over the past decade or so around these issues, a fundamental question that I've continued to ask myself is, how can North American Christianity decouple whiteness from Christianity? And when I say whiteness, I don't mean white people in the ontological sense, like people, but whiteness itself as a performance of some kind. There's a brilliant lecture that I was just made aware of by Dr. Willie Jennings from Yale. Brilliant. He gave it at Fuller Theological. You got to see it. And the title of his lecture is, "How Can White People Be Saved?" And when he says white people, he's talking about people who just perform whiteness. And he begins to describe what that looks like. So for me, this is what is going to have to happen, especially when we consider, from a Christian standpoint, what Christ is about, which is inaugurating a new creation, inaugurating transformation and healing in the world. So if forms of whiteness or performing of whiteness, and for me, within church world, I see whiteness as a kind of liturgy, a kind of performance or work of the people that is, quite frankly, deformed. I don't mean white people. I'm talking about the practice of whiteness itself. And so there has to be a conversation around how we decouple this. And so there's a question the other day. I was talking to a theologian at Hood Theological Seminary here in Salisbury, And I asked a question. I said, what would North American Christianity look like if white supremacy or whiteness was not at its root? How would that even look? And that's a question I've thrown out there and I'll continue to ask myself.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, we just have a few minutes left. And Janelle, I want to thank you again for coming on and sharing a bit more with us about this research. What happens next with this research? You said it's going into a book. What is that process? When will people be able to, these findings and for themselves? And
great. Well, I just want to say it's been a wonderful conversation, very difficult kind of topic, I think, because there are no easy answers. And this is a sort of microcosm of where we're at in the United States today in terms of politics. But I do think that hopefully the book is being published by Russell Sage Foundation, who also helped to sponsor this research. And it's in production now, so the book should be out in May. And it's actually a pretty slim volume. I think it ends up raising a lot of questions about where do we go from here. That has been something that editors have really pushed me on. As you can see from this conversation, it's not clear where we go from here. I have struggled with it. How do we move forward from here? And I feel so grateful to the other panelists for their ideas about what is next for us. So I really appreciate this opportunity.
yeah, thank you. And thanks again, Gerardo and Anthony, for taking an hour here and being a part of this conversation. The issues that we are, with Transform Network, we're really concerned about, care deeply about, and feel called to address. And so we hope folks will check out transformnetwork.org. Anthony is one of our board members, and the work that we're trying to do to help to provide resources to faith communities and to address these kinds of issues, because my gosh, and we got to get to it. So grateful to the data, to the research, for your work in helping us at least to be able to see it more clearly and see how big the issues are and how big the need is to deal with all of this. So I just want to say thanks to all of you. Thanks to the folks who have been watching this. This video will be archived, be able to be shared and viewed later, and look forward to future open conversations down the road with Transform Network. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Have a good day.